Okay, thank you for tuning in to listen to Canada and coronavirus. What is happening? How do we analyze the situation right now? Well, Canada has been hit just like every country around the world. And what we found is the capitalist class, the capitalist states around the planet have been totally unprepared. And Canada's not much better than everywhere else. For example, in the last 24 hours, over 1,000 people have tested positive for COVID-19. They've tested positive, and that's a reflection of the actions or inactions of the government from 2 weeks ago. And so now these people are sick, 1,000 tested, thousands more we don't know about because the government has not been acting. What were they doing 2 weeks ago? Well, on just over 2 weeks ago, on March 11th, Justin Trudeau got up in front of the Canadian people and announced a very limited bailout, but a bailout that reflected all of his priorities. What are those priorities? Profits before people. He gave $10 billion of bailouts to corporations and banks and $5 million in minor reforms to the employment insurance system. $5 million. That is half of 1%. Half of 1% to workers and 99.5% to corporations. That has been the priorities of capitalist governments from the beginning of this crisis. But it's not just how they responded to the crisis in the last few weeks, the last month, when it became sort of a global phenomenon. It's how they've been reacting over the previous decades. If you look at statistics in Canada in the 1980s, you will see that Canada had more than 6.5 hospital beds per 1,000 people. Over the last 30 or 40 years of cutbacks and austerity, that number from 6.5 has gone down to less than half of that, 2.5, just over 2.5. That is the current situation. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, says that an acceptable level is 5 beds per 1,000 head of population. So it's half of what is necessary. That is the condition of austerity, of tax cuts, of cutting services, cutting healthcare, cutting education, cutting nursing, cutting all of the what we need to weather these crises. What else? Hallway healthcare. That's been a major issue, especially in Ontario. It's been a political football that's been passed around. That in normal times, again, recommended levels of capacity in hospitals. Hospitals shouldn't run higher than 80% capacity, precisely to prepare for crises, to prepare for outbreaks just like this. What's been happening in Ontario and many other Canadian provinces? Well, it hasn't been 80%, it hasn't been 90%, hasn't even been 100%. It's been 105% of capacity just in normal times. So they've had to put people in the hallways, hence hallway healthcare. Massive underfunding, massive crisis. And so Canada goes into this crisis really, really underprepared. It's actually got fewer beds per head of population than Italy, United States, Britain, France, countries like this. It is one of the least prepared. So if the infection rates get to the same level as Italy or Spain or the United States, which is seems to be totally out of control, if that happens, the healthcare system is really, really underprepared. But then what has actually happened in the last few weeks is again, their actions have always been delayed. They've been delayed and not prepared to take the necessary actions to stop this virus in its tracks. I talked about 10 billion for corporations, 5 million for workers in a minor reform. But they refused again and again to issue proper sick pay, proper leave, so that people could say, I'm going to stay home and not go into work sick. Again, that's another thing from the previous period. The Doug Ford government in Ontario and many other governments have been cutting back on sick pay. You got management, human resources talking about absenteeism, saying that workers are being lazy malingerers for taking a day off because they're sick. It's utterly disgusting and it's endangering human lives, especially now amongst the pandemic, but also just in the normal functioning of capitalism, forcing people to work while they're sick, having no sick days, and cutting everything to the bone. Sick days are an absolute vital necessity for all workers and for the health and safety of people. You don't want people being forced into sick. You don't want food service workers being forced in sick. That's how these things spread around. So that's been cut back. And Trudeau was delaying announcing any support. And then when he did announce support, it was very bureaucratic. It was through the employment insurance system, which 70%, 65-70% of workers don't qualify for. It's through having to jump through all of these bureaucratic hoops to get, and so people were left in incredible confusion, and were forced to go to work sick, which spread the virus further, made situation far worse. And why are they delayed? Why this delay? The purpose for the delay is precisely they don't want to give working class people anything that we might want to keep when this is all over, right? That whether it's sick pay, whether it's any kind of welfare benefits or anything like that, they've been delaying. Now Trudeau's been forced to give this $2,000 ahead. It took him several weeks and significant pressure to do that. But even this, $2,000, well, that just shows that if $2,000 is a subsistence level of existence, well, what about welfare rates? Welfare rates are half that, half $2,000. How people are supposed to survive on that, I don't know. And there'll be a big demand when the crisis is over that welfare rates, look, if $2,000 was acceptable for the general population, then it should be acceptable for people on welfare. But he's been forced to this through mass pressure from below. But again, everything, it's putting the corporations first. I see memes out there, that there's a big fire in society, and what are they doing? They're spraying water on the banks and ignoring the people as they're burning, right? Everything's to save the banks, everything's to save the corporations. They're funneling billions of dollars. Now, the latest bailout is like $100 billion. But even there, twice the amount is being funneled into corporate welfare, tax deferrals and bailouts than is being given to working class people. That again shows the priorities. And in terms of the tax measures, who's going to benefit more from a tax deferral? Well, it's going to be the richer people who pay higher brackets of tax. So again, the priorities, profits before people. That is the entire approach of the government. So where next? Well, we're in this economic crisis. We're in an economic crisis, and this has been the spark, that the pinprick that has burst the bubble of the economy. There's been incredible economic dislocation. Something like, I think in a period of 1 week, 1 million people applied for unemployment. There's actually estimates that there's going to be 4 million people applying for this emergency benefit. If that happens, well, the 1 million people in 1 week, that was twice the rate of increase in unemployment than the worst month in the Great Depression in 1932. That in 1 week, a 5% increase in the total unemployment figures. And so if 4 million people lose their jobs, that's going to be a 20% increase to the unemployment statistics. So Canadian unemployment will be at something like 25%, an unprecedented figure. And people say, well, you know, this is just due to coronavirus. This there's going to be a shock to the economy as coronavirus hits, but we'll recover soon. Well, that's not true. That's not true. And actually, if you go to Marxist.ca and Marxist.com and read our articles on economics, I personally wrote an article in September of last year titled Explaining the Coming Crisis of Capitalism, that a big crisis was in preparation even before coronavirus. And there was a whole bunch of indicators, most importantly, overproduction. Overproduction or overcapacity is how the capitalist measures this. Overcapacity, that they cannot run, the factories cannot run production to its productive potential. And so factories sit idle, and because the market cannot suck up those goods. Another example of this crisis of overproduction is the phenomenon of dead money. They have billions and billions of dollars, actually now over $1 trillion Canadian, of money that is just sitting in bank accounts doing absolutely nothing. Uninvested, unexpended, doing nothing. They're just like a dragon sitting on a pile of gold. It does nothing. And that pile gets bigger by $65 billion every year that the capitalists don't know what to do with. Because why? There's no point investing when productive capacity is being maxed out. Why invest in new production when the existing productive capacity can actually produce what the market can consume? Of course, there's all these shortages in terms of terrible housing, lack of education, lack of infrastructure. Those are the needs that need to be funded, but the capitalists, they don't profit from that, so they don't care. They just keep the money for themselves, uninvested, useless. So this is the example of the capitalist crisis of overproduction that was in preparation. And we were explaining that and saying there's going to be a spark that triggers off the economic crisis. We don't know what that spark is going to be, but now we know the spark is COVID-19. That has triggered this economic crisis. And therefore, it's not likely to be resolved anytime soon. It's not going to be resolved anytime soon because it is the underlying contradictions of overproduction plus debt. And debt really exacerbates this crisis. What needs to be done? What needs to be done? What would a workers' government, what would a socialist government do in this crisis? Well, first of all, we wouldn't have underfunded healthcare for decades. We would have maintained the necessary funding, necessary bed ratio, necessary amount of ventilators and trained doctors and nurses and masks and gowns and all of the other protective equipment. The capitalists are woefully underfunding and undersupplying that. So we wouldn't have found ourselves in this terrible condition beforehand. May add that Cuba, which is which has a planned economy, there are problems in Cuba, partially due to the American blockade, and there needs to be more workers' democracy in Cuba. But Cuba has a planned economy and free education and free healthcare, and it has been able to respond fairly well to the coronavirus crisis precisely because it has a planned economy. And we would learn from that lesson and improve it on the basis of an advanced economy of Canada. But so we wouldn't have underfunded things in the previous period. Cuba is sending doctors to Italy to assist, and China is sending other resources also, although it's a capitalist economy now. But what would we do? Well, we would make sure that all of the resources are mobilized. First of all, every worker gets full pay, and all non-essential industries are shut down. You can't have people going to work and spreading the virus. And for those of you, people in essential industries, in healthcare, in food distribution, etc., etc., that needs to be done. Well, they need to get all of the protective equipment necessary, and they've got to have double hazard pay. Because you're hearing stories of superstore workers getting ill and dying, transit workers getting ill and dying. It's utterly criminal that they're not getting hazard pay. They absolutely demand hazard pay and every possible protection imaginable. But yeah, everybody else needs to be staying home, essential service. Like last week in Ontario and Quebec, they said, oh, we're going to shut down all non-essential workplaces. And it sounded like, oh, wow, it's quite something coming from Doug Ford. You thought that this was surprisingly progressive. But then you notice, again, devil is always in the details in the small print. The list of essential workplaces was ridiculous. I think it was 75 different categories or something like that. There was like jokes going around like, the people who were considered non-essential were like owl stuffers or something, It was utterly ridiculous, the jobs that weren't included as essential. And most notably, the construction industry, the entire construction industry is being viewed as essential, including the condo boom. So there was actually a very powerful video of a construction worker in North Toronto saying to his fellow workers that this is utter bullshit. We shouldn't be here. We're not essential. They're just trying to maximize profits. Again, profits before people. That's the thing. So no. How do you actually determine what is and is not essential? You cannot trust the capitalist government, Doug Ford, Justin Trudeau, any of the rest of them. The only people who can decide what is actually essential is the working class, are the workers themselves. They know. And even within that, okay, even within some essential workplaces, like Shoppers Drug Mart, the pharmacies, I heard reports that now, of course, pharmacies, yes, that is essential. People need to get their medications, that is essential. But is the cosmetics area of the Shoppers Drug Mart essential? I don't think so. I don't think anybody's going to be getting a makeover right now. So, no, the workers need to decide what is and is not essential. And there needs to be full pay for everybody who's at home, because they are not essential. And if the capitalists, if they say they can't afford that, well, open the books. Open the books. Let the workers decide whether you can actually afford it. And if they genuinely don't have the money, if they genuinely can't afford it, take them over, expropriate them, nationalize them, and save the jobs, run it by the working class. So instead of these bailouts all going to the capitalists, they put it in their back pocket, or the bailouts going to the bankers, the financiers, the stockbrokers. It's like pouring trickling water on a hot pan in terms of the stock market. It makes no difference. Actually, at one point, the stock market was down, had lost 1/3 of its value. 8 years of growth had been eradicated of the stock market. Although in the last week, that's been going back up again. After Trump has been saying he doesn't care if people die, the economy comes first. And it shows that the capitalist economy does not care about human life. Actually is built upon the misery and the suffering of working class people. and that has temporarily boosted the stock market up, which also goes to show how parasitic the stock market is, because the genuine economy is in free fall. There are millions and millions of people being unemployed, and production is stopping. So it shows the parasitic nature of the stock market and how they live off that. So that's what we would do. We shut down on all non-essential production. We would give double hazard pay to genuinely essential workers, and no bailouts. Instead, take it over by the working class. Expropriate production. In fact, that the bailouts to these corporations are enough to buy them out. They're enough to, based upon the suppressed share value of these companies, the amount of money that's being gifted to them in various subsidies and wage subsidies and the rest of them, you could buy these things out. The government could nationalise them at fair market value. I don't think it should be nationalised at fair market value. I think they should be expropriated. It's already been paid for after decades of other tax cuts and welfare and corporate welfare and the rest of it. But even on fair market value, the degree of the bailouts is enough to buy these companies out and nationalise them. What has been the response? What is to be done? That's the next question. What are we going to do about this? Well, what has been the answer of the trade unions or the New Democratic Party? Well, there was an utterly scandalous message from the Canadian Labour Congress at the beginning of the crisis, that they issued this letter that said nothing except to say they were working hand in hand with corporations and government. Total betrayal, total class collaboration, nothing about sick pay, nothing about emergency services, nothing about protecting those on the front lines with proper personal protective equipment, nothing about that. Just we're working with the bosses. Utter betrayal. And the NDP wasn't much better, to be honest. When Trudeau announced his sort of second bailout, which gave more in tax cuts and deferrals than it did to workers, then Jagmeet Singh actually said, oh, he welcomed it. He welcomed it. I think at the time Trudeau was offering $1,800 in a very bureaucratic system, when the cost of a one-bedroom apartment, the rent of a one-bedroom apartment on the Toronto market right now is $2,300. How are people supposed to survive on $1,800, right? Jagmeet Singh said, oh, that was very good, but maybe we should give a little bit more to small businesses. Very, very, very mild criticism. Now, due to the pressure from below, the NDP and the unions had to sharpen their line a little bit, and Trudeau's been forced to give over more. But the lack of leadership is immense. The lack of leadership is immense, and people cannot pay their rent. People are losing their jobs, being laid off in the millions, and aren't being getting their full pay, while the bosses and the bankers are all being bailed out. So what do we need to do to achieve what the workers need? Well, there are two tactics. Well, we're not going to organise mass demonstrations in the middle of this crisis. I think that would be irresponsible to organise mass demonstrations. And we're not necessarily going to be organising picket lines and bringing people out that way. But there have been numerous examples of workers organising stay-home strikes, sit-ins. In fact, the Service Canada has recently moved from the Service Canada offices have moved entirely due to online and phone, precisely because the workers there refused to stay open. They organised a sit-in, and that sit-in was, the news of that was suppressed in the media. They didn't talk about it. They said, oh no, we've just moved to online. The reality is that the frontline workers refused because of the massive flood of unemployed people. So there was huge lineups into these Service Canada offices, a huge health threat. and so the workers correctly did a stay home strike and are now working from home. So much better. So any of these non-essential workplaces, building condos, etc., needs to be a stay-home strike. We need to, and if any major trade union leader started calling for stay-home strikes, then that would have a massive effect. Massive effect. Same. The other thing is rent strikes. Rent strikes can be hugely powerful. People can't afford their rent. Although rent strikes shouldn't just be for people who can't afford the rent. They need to be organised like a union, a rent strikers union, rent payers union, to make collective demands. Shut down all non-essential production, everybody keeps their pay, and double hazard pay for emergency workers, for frontline workers, all of the personal protective equipment, and yes, rent forgiveness, and no evictions, no evictions, utterly vital. So these are the type of direct action that can be taken, that working class people can do. Stay home strikes and rent strikes, but it's got to be organised. It's got to be political. It can't just be atomised. Each individual person not paying their rent. It's got to be part of a political movement with political demands. So where next? Where next after coronavirus? And I guess a bit of hope in that the human race will survive this. This is not the apocalypse. We will survive, but we, the working class and society, will not be the same people as before. So Marx quote, "Social conditions determine social consciousness." It is the most common, one of the most common arguments against socialism and against communism is, well, that's all well and good, those are some beautiful ideas, but it'll never happen because people like the status quo. Well, the status quo has been ripped up. This has had an utter radicalizing effect upon mass consciousness. People have massively changed their conditions of life. All of us have been forced to sort of quarantine inside, unless we've been declared essential when we're not essential. And some of us will get sick. Some of us who have friends will get sick. Some of us have friends or family member who die, tragically, due to the inaction of the capitalists putting profits before people. And that will have a radicalizing effect upon consciousness. People who are not prepared to fight because, it's not great, but it's not that bad. Well, it is that bad. And people, when it's a life or death question, people will be prepared to fight. Rosa Luxemburg, famous quote, said it was a choice between socialism or barbarism. And that is the reality before the working class. That is the reality, socialism or barbarism of corporate rule. And we'll see how many people they let die before we get to the other side of this. Italy and Spain are in terrible conditions. I think the United States is in a horrendous situation. And so millions of people could potentially die. But eventually, this too shall pass. This will end and people will come out. And what will be the situation? Well, we'll find ourselves when COVID is gone, we'll find ourselves still in an economic crisis, and capitalist governments have thrown billions of dollars, trillions of dollars potentially, at this, mostly at the corporations. And then the question will arise, who pays? Who pays? Because the debt levels will be through the roof. Actually, family debt was already through the roof, 175% of annual income. We explained that in our Canadian Perspectives document that we published this past week. Canada before and after the coronavirus was the title of that article. That 175% of annual wages was annual income was personal debt. But corporate debt, that'll be through the roof, and government debt especially, all of these bailouts. And what's going to happen to those bailouts? So at the moment they're giving cheap loans, cheap credit to corporations. Historically, if you look for the Great Recession from 2009, they wrote off the majority of those loans. That billions were given to GM and Chrysler and Bombardier and other big corporations. And that's peanuts compared with the bailouts they are giving now. In fact, actually, the bailouts they're giving now are I think there's like 2 or 3 times the size of the Marshall Plan and the sort of other previous bailouts. So it's huge figures, and it's all going to get enlarged. And most of that is going to get written off. How are they going to pay for that? Well, there's 2 choices. You either make the bosses pay or you make the workers pay. We say make the bosses pay. We say no bailouts, nationalise, expropriate. The capitalists have shown that they cannot run society, they cannot run the economy, they don't care about the lives of working class people. The only people you can trust, people the workers can trust, are the workers themselves. We should run it for need and not for profit. But we know that the capitalists aren't going to be saying that. They are going to try and make the workers pay. So all of the benefits that have been given in the crisis, they're going to take all of that back. The $2,000 a month, welfare rates, any sick pay, they're going to try and take that back. Absolutely everything they're going to take back. But they're not going to stop there. They're going to say that all of the benefits that we had from the post-war period, they are no longer affordable. There's going to be a vicious regime of austerity. A vicious regime of austerity. And you combine that with a working class that is radicalized and prepared to fight from this period of pandemic, well, that's an explosive mix. The question of who pays is actually been the trigger of the majority of revolutions in human history. You know, whether it's the aristocracy or the peasantry, the workers or the bosses, etc., etc. Who pays is normally the key issue there. And so there can be some very, very sharp struggles in the time to come. Defensive struggles, fight to survive, socialism or barbarism during the pandemic, but afterwards, who pays? And that's why Fight Back and the International Marxist Tendency exist. That's why we exist. Because as individuals, the workers are merely raw material for exploitation. We need to be organised. And we cannot cope with this terrible, terrible leadership of the trade unions and the Labour parties, the Social Democratic Labour parties, that is unwilling to fight. In fact, is more afraid of the workers than they are the bosses. They don't want to spark off something that might get out of hand and be dangerous. No. We need to spark off workers' fight because only the working class can save the working class. That's why you need a revolutionary organisation. That's why you need a revolutionary organisation to hold things together during this pandemic, and we're doing a series of educational discussions to hold things together, to train people, educate people, help people understand the reality of capitalism and how it doesn't care for people, only cares for profits. But most importantly, after the pandemic period is over and the austerity comes, to help people organise and fight back and win. Those are going to be the period ahead of us, a revolutionary period. It is a revolutionary period internationally. Support for the ideas of socialism were going up and up and up even before this crisis. Imagine what's going to happen to working class consciousness and the consciousness of the youth and oppressed people in this situation. So that's why it's absolutely necessary to support and join and build a revolutionary fighting organisation to help the workers overcome this situation and win socialism to avoid barbarism in our lifetime. Thank you.